Hello, hi there. It's Jason from the Crypto Cycle channel. Welcome back and thanks for tuning in. We're here to look at the continuation video series that I've been doing with regards to the circles of risk. We're going to be looking at the use cases today for the Bitmap standard. Hopefully you'll enjoy this one, so let's get straight into it. Before I set out to make this video, I put a tweet on Twitter asking for the community to help and basically provides their thoughts and any sort of commentary they had on what the potential use case is for the Bitmap standard. And kindly, Batoshi Blokamoto saw my tweet and retweeted it. So I just want to say a big thank you for that, because obviously that connected me with so many people in the space. And I just want to say to the people that did reach out with their ideas, I want to say thank you. And hopefully you'll see your ideas are in here and that they're covered in some way. So let's get straight into the use cases. So the first use case that I'm going to cover is, can the bitmap itself be considered a piece of art, either through it being an inscription or simply by the illustrative representation of the bitmap itself? I think it's fair to say that we've now come accustomed to different types of bitmaps. If you've been following the social media Twitter space, you've probably seen that there are lots of different representations of these different bitmaps in terms of how they are illustrated. Some see these as bitmap punks, and some see them as totally different pieces of land. You may have seen this graph that's on the screen, which illustrates all these different sort of profiling for the different types of bitmaps. If you haven't checked what you have, maybe you can check against this. It's what's being recognized in the space. Some are looking to show off these bitmaps. There have been some people in the space that have been creating these like 3D models of them, which I think looks really cool. And you just want to have them in some sort of digital gallery ultimately. And it does remind me a little bit of when people were collecting the CryptoPunks and how proud they were, I guess, to show them off in their virtual collection. And sometimes they actually posted them on their screens in their offices or in their homes. Essentially, no different to a piece of art, a painting, which I think is really, really interesting. The other thing, which again gives me reason to say that this could genuinely be a use case for Bitmap, because ultimately it's already recognized. It's already being a potential valuation. It's almost like it's a way of valuing what one's bitmap is in terms of how cool it looks or how clean it looks, which again, I think is a valid reason for why this could be a use case. The other one, which you may argue it's not necessarily art, but many do talk about the inscription number itself. So could you say that is art? Maybe, maybe not. But I do find that people admire different numbers, either it being just because there's some sort of comic behind it, or it relates to a special date. And again, you could say that could fit into an art collection, because you could essentially do some sort of printout or put it in a digital TV frame or whatever you want to call it and display it for others to see, to say, look, I own that. That's in my collection. So I do think that it's really valid. So continuing on the theme of this potentially being considered a piece of art or a collectible item, I think there are a few questions we need to ask first. And the first one that you can see is that I've asked, well, is there an artist then for these blocks? And the other question, which I think is extremely useful to understand, is that, well, if there is an artist to these blocks or these block representations, could there potentially be some copyright issues? Because as far as we're concerned, we've inscribed the bitmap number, which is against the block number, and that's our claim to ownership. So I think it's really important to ask these questions. And could there be anything that could ultimately take those rights to claiming these pieces of art away from us? So the first question is there an artist that has created these block representations? And I'm sure you know already, but the answer is no. But we can't discount the fact that they have obviously originated from somewhere. And I'm sure you are familiar with Bitfeed, because that is where essentially everyone is snipping these bitmap representations from. So I thought, well, let's have a look into the Bitfeed website. So if you look on the screen, I thought it was just worth noting that the Bitfeed is currently an experiment, and there's a name of @monoautical. I hope I've said that right. And it looks like that this, I don't know if this is an individual or there's a team behind this, but ultimately, there is obviously someone behind this that has essentially created this, this website, this portal for where you can enter a block number and see the representation of it in a art form, I guess, as well as it having all the attributes of each individual block. As I was going through the information on Bitfeed, which anyone can do, you just click on one of the information buttons that they've got on there if you want to know more about the site and what the V bytes mean, etc. That it's quite interesting if you haven't checked it out. But there's this this statement on there which says Bitfeed illustrates this movement from the mempool into each newly discovered block, arranging confirmed transactions to show the total number and distribution of values. So just reading that first line there, Bitfeed illustrates this movement from the mempool into each newly discovered block. So that's basically them saying this is their take on how the blocks look, which I think is really, really interesting. But if you then go to the mempool, which again is another source of where you can see what these blocks look like, and if you were then to type a block number and then do a comparison exercise against the block number on Bitfeed, if you haven't done this, and you may not know this, the reality is that you actually get two different and totally two different representations of the block. So I found that really, really interesting. So I looked into that in a bit more detail. So we've got here two blocks. So the one on the left-hand side is the Bitfeed block. And I'm showing this in the VBytes form because on the mempool website, if you follow my cursor, that to me is also being illustrated in the VBytes format. So I've left it as it is, just so we can compare the two. And as you can clearly see, them sort of standing side by side, they look different. And I even looked at rotating it, etc. No, they are different. And what I found really interesting actually is that there are only, I think, 3 pieces of data that are also consistent across both platforms. One is the timestamp. So on both, the timestamps are exactly the same, which is fine. So that's good. The other is the amount of transactions. They are both the same as well. Obviously, the block number is consistent as well. In this case, we reviewed the 800,000th block on both the bitfeed and mempool. So I guess then to answer the question of, well, is there a copyright issue? At the moment, I don't think there is, because both the bitfeed and mempool have not been interested in what these representations are. It's just the byproduct ultimately of the work that they've done. You know, they just want to show what these Bitcoin blocks look like ultimately. It isn't what they set out to do to create different art pieces of all these different blocks. And if you actually then carry on reading, especially on the mempool website, and I feel that it's with both of them really, they talk about open source, which to me again isn't really them claiming that they own any of these image rights, or claiming to want to own any of these image rights of these blocks, which again I think should mean that there aren't any issues with with copyright ultimately. Ultimately, the bitmap number that we have is the district, as we know. And under the bitmap theory, the number of transactions are the parcels. So those two pieces of information, which are consistent across the two different platforms, are consistent. So that's good. I also took off the mempool website something which I think is really interesting to just make everyone aware of, really. And basically what it says on there is that a mempool is the queue of pending and unconfirmed transactions for a cryptocurrency network node. So this is where it gets interesting. There is no one global mempool. Every node on the network maintains its own mempool. So different nodes may hold different transactions in their mempools. Now, I don't know if I'm understanding that correctly, but the way I'm looking at that is, well, again, just looking at that, so different nodes may hold different transactions in their mempools. Does that mean on each node there may be a totally different representation of the block? In that case, there'd be many. So I do think that's quite interesting if that is how I've understood it. I think it's fair to say that the community have probably mostly recognised Bitfeed as the platform that truly represents one's block. But it's probably just worth reminding everyone, and you may recall this from one of my last videos, that the only issue I see at the moment with this is that we don't own the block. So there could ultimately be another standard created, like I did cover in one of my last videos. Like instead of bitmap, it could be bitland or bitworld, and follow a same or similar type of standard or process of inscribing those blocks. And in the end, you could have 2, 3, 4, multiple different standards that are all claiming ownership of those blocks. And in turn, basically, you're all saying you own the same type of art piece. So I guess on this particular use case, I am a little bit reserved on it. But if Bitmap is what everyone recognizes as the only one, then perhaps It's here to stay, and it can be considered as a potential art piece or art collection. Therefore, I think for now that it really is just something to show off or flex if you've got a cool representation of your block. I think that's fair enough. Is it a potential use case for the future? Well, look, who knows? It's obviously something that's being realised and being used to value these different bitmaps as we speak. So let's see how it develops, and let's move on to the next use case. That brings us on to the second use case. And what we're going to be looking at is, can the bitmap be used as a key, a pass, or some sort of ticket into an exclusive network, perhaps? I appreciate that this might be a simple take on it as what could be considered for bitmap as a use case, but I don't think it's something we should fully discount. Think about it. It could be something into some sort of event that only bitmap holders can have access to. It could be into some sort of potential members club, or maybe it's the key to whatever the metaverse becomes. Again, by it being a pass, it could be something that gives you access or rights to some sort of whitelisting event. So you can get someone's art, perhaps, earlier than others, gives you some sort of priority ranking over others that don't hold these bitmaps. It's something which I think is really, really interesting. I appreciate this may be seen as a bit centralized, but you could argue that you have ultimately invested in something, but ultimately it could give you some privileges, which I think is interesting. I mean, think about it. I don't know if you have this in other countries, but here in the UK, we have like professional bodies, and I genuinely imagine it's the same elsewhere. But when I mean professional bodies, like it's associations essentially of particular fields. So here you might have like an engineering chartership association that people are members of, and they have to pay like yearly inscriptions or subscriptions for to be a part of that network, and they get invites, they get access to events that are carried out by the association itself, which not all members of the public will have access to. So I see it every day. I did say that you may see it as a centralized approach. However, my only argument to that is that, well, anyone technically at the moment can inscribe a bitmap if they want to. There are plenty for sale at the moment. So in the future, I guess the only sort of barrier to entry will be that if it goes where we think it's going to go, some of these bitmaps are going to be extremely expensive to own. So that could obviously be a blocker. But ultimately, it's always still open for people to join, which I think is still a decentralized view on it. I think this is genuinely a use case that could probably be adopted today. That you're somehow part of the Bitmap club. Let's put it that way. Don't know if that's going to take on with the community, but that's how I see it. At the moment, if you're a holder or you're looking to be a holder, you're basically going to be in the Bitmap club. And essentially, your membership will always be tied to being a holder of a bitmap, because you'll be able to prove that you've got the inscription rights to that block and you are ultimately the owner of it, because either you bought it on the secondary market or you were first to inscribe it. So that will always be there as your proof to say, I am in this bitmap club. Let's now move on to the next use case. So the next use case we're going to look at on Bitmap is games and potentially what could be built on it. So you may have seen already that there are some attempts at the moment to build games on this bitmap standard, which I think is really, really interesting. I believe some of these have been on chain and off chain. I guess coming back to the previous use case that I looked at in terms of a pass or a ticket, that could potentially also be used to get access to off chain games, perhaps. Only bitmap holders can get access to play these games. Just a thought. So you can see some examples of games that are being developed at the moment, which I think is really interesting. There was one other one which I couldn't get a hold of. I just can't find where it was, but someone actually tried to also create like a Tetris game, which I thought was pretty interesting. And the one that we've probably become quite familiar with in the Twitter space is the Bitmap Valley project that Chris is working on. And I have mentioned this in previous videos as well. And this does look really, really cool. And I can't wait to play it. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how some of these games develop and how detailed and lifelike they'll become over time. Obviously, in their current format, they're very sort of blocky and perhaps as basic as they can be from a game perspective. However, I do think it's really, really cool and interesting. And there's some sort of like retro vibe to them that I quite enjoy. One other thing which may be an absolute long shot, but thought was worth mentioning is could these bitmaps also be potentially storage areas for games? You could go and access these games from the blockchain and play them. Perhaps a library or directory to find them. And you could also probably apply that to movies as well. I know that's a long shot, but just as the thought process was going through, it was just something that made me think about. At this stage, I don't think there's too much more to explore with games because, again, it's very much its infancy, but it's definitely something that, look, there are people developing games for the bitmap standard. So let's see how that develops. I do truly think it is a potential use case, but we just have to be patient and see what happens. The next potential use case is advertising. And this could be something which could have some form of potential under the bitmap standard. This idea originated from when I looked at the Sandbox project. And I don't know if it was intentionally meant to be for advertising when people started plotting different logos on their blocks or pieces of land or parcels, however you want to call it. But I thought it was interesting because, we've probably come accustomed to the ordinals wallet maps that have been produced, as well as under the bitmap land, where they've also put a similar type of map in place for all the different blocks to illustrate how the blocks sit with each other. And again, appreciate you can't perhaps do it today, but was thinking, well, could you or will someone tag a advertising logo, or will someone tag a logo to one of these blocks in the future to advertise their products, their company, or whatever it is? There may be a potential use case there for that. In one of my last videos, that under ordinals theory, there is the potential to tag like a JPEG to a Satoshi. And I guess in some ways, you probably could do that with your company logo as well. if you have it in a JPEG format. But you are going to have to go into that level of detail to go and find that Satoshi to then see that logo, which I'm not quite sure the use case is there for that. Don't think anyone wants to do that. Right now, in terms of people putting logos on their blocks, etc., within one of these map type representations, I'm not really seeing that as a use case right now. And perhaps it's not really one to consider for the future. Use case is data storage. And really, I guess this sort of continues the ordinal theory type concepts of where you can tag information onto Satoshis, etc. So it made me question and think. And in fact, this was an idea that one of the community members sent across, which really made me think about it. And you can really see the potential value in it. Ultimately, it's a secure and decentralized way. So I just put some photo examples on the screen. And, obviously, depending on the file size, you could put a raft of information attached through your bitmap standard. And, this could be legal, public documents, perhaps, that, one is happy to be out there in the public domain. Could be historic artifacts. I think it's quite an interesting idea. Although right now, it's obviously not what I believe is ultimately what the bitmap standard will be used for. And ultimately, I don't think you're going to want any sort of private, photographs of your family, etc., on there that you'd want to use it as a storage system. I do think it might have legs for, like I said earlier, about it being for maybe open source government type projects where they've had to have like public procurement for some sort of service and get it agreed with some sort of contractor, and they need to publicly share that. Perhaps that's something that it could have a use. However, there's not much more worth discussing on this use case because ultimately it's not one that I think will grow and really be a thing in the future. That now brings us onto our last use case, which is the metaverse. This is ultimately what we've all envisaged that the bitmap standard will be for. I think it's worth reminding everyone of the concepts that Satoshi Nakamoto came up with, his theory. And I've got up that slide, which is really prominent on the Bitmap 101. And it's there, so let's just read it. Welcome to Bitmap, a transmutational metaverse, standard tapping into the Bitcoin blockchain. And then if we go right to the end and read the last sentence, it says, it's a new frontier in the world of decentralized digital ownership and the new understanding of the metaverse. This is ultimately what Bitmap's been designed for. That's why we're here. That's what's grabbed our attention. This is the ultimate use case for Bitmap. You could probably also say that all the other use cases that we've looked through could end up in the metaverse regardless. So actually, they can all be relevant to the Bitmap standard in some way. There's also been a recent monologue by Satoshi Nakamoto on Twitter. I've got a small extract there on the screen. However, I do recommend that you go on his Twitter handle and profile and check his monologue out. It is quite a long read, but it's really interesting to see his insights and thoughts on the metaverse and, the decentralized and centralized world. So please do go check that out. The reality is there are already a number of projects that are really attempting to make this metaverse vision a reality. I've put a few examples of some projects that are working on this at the moment. And I think it's really, really important to recognize that this is today. This is what's being built on today. The bitmap standard has not been around for long at all. And there are already some of these projects that have basically signed up to the fact that they're going to develop this for Bitmap. Now, I appreciate that some of these projects may have already started on other chains prior to it coming to Bitmap. However, hopefully Bitmap has given the fuel to some of these projects, and hopefully they can see how important this is, that we need this standard to bring consistency to this metaverse world. As I said, we are at the discovery stage. We're looking to understand how these blocks and illustrations can work. And I just think that is really, really fascinating. It's like a construction project waiting to happen, but we're just at the base layer, the land. We need to excavate to put the foundations in, etc. That's where we ultimately are at the moment. People are having fun and playing with their systems to see what they can bring to the space. And any little innovation or improvement that any of these potential people or teams and projects that bring to this space is always going to put a one step ahead for where we want the metaverse to really end up becoming. And as we are at this discovery stage, it's really important to understand that it's a trial and error phase. Mistakes are bound to happen. And as a community, we can't get frustrated. We can't get angry. We can't think, come on, hurry up. When's Lambo? Let's not worry about that. This is going to be a really long journey, but it's going to be ultimately really worth it. So we just need to be all patient, but we will find what the real value will be in time. I don't think I need to say much more on the metaverse. As I said, it could almost be all the use cases that we've gone through in this video. And ultimately, we actually don't really know what the metaverse will be today, let alone tomorrow. But I think we all appreciate that the metaverse isn't going anywhere. It's going to be something, and it's going to be something ingrained in all our lives. It should be in our generation, but definitely in our children's generation and our grandchildren's generation. And it would be amazing if we can be one of those first generations to be a part and to make that history and lay the stepping stones for the future generations to come. For me, the metaverse is really about connecting all these silo projects that exist and bringing them together. Because there'll be so many different projects that so many people are going to find absolutely fascinating. But we need this sort of central connection that brings everything together, which hopefully the Bitmap standard brings. It perhaps will be something that works in parallel with our real world, with perhaps how we work, how we live, how we socialize, how we build relationships, how we build our networks with people. Some may find it exciting, and I appreciate some will find it horrific. However you like it, the metaverse is coming. We don't know in what sort of shape or form it's going to arrive in, but it is coming. Unless somebody turns off the power and shuts off all the networks. But that seems very unlikely. So coming back to reviewing the use case for the Bitmap standard, I've taken a different view on perhaps the other risks that I looked at previously, purely because of how early we are with this idea. So instead of giving it the green light, I've given it a blue light. And I think it's something that we just have to progress with caution ultimately, because it's so early. The idea itself is concrete, but the use cases need time. They need investments, they need projects, they need people, developers to come into this space and make this standard something incredible. And that is where we need to be patient. Ultimately, there may be a use case that I haven't even covered in this video. You may even know what that use case could potentially be. And that is what I find fascinating with this. But like I said, we just need to see how this develops and how time will create the use case for Bitmap. I think this will be a video that I definitely come back to and do an update on once we find what the potential use cases are for Bitmap as things develop over time. Like I said, there could be something that we haven't even thought of that transpires out of this whole journey through some sort of, organic innovation, I guess. So that brings us to the end of the video, which I hope you like. If you haven't already, please like the video and subscribe, as well as share it amongst your community. The more that we can bring into this space, the more we can grow the Bitmap standard for everyone to hopefully potentially enjoy and get involved with, because it is something that I'm excited about and I'm sure you are too. Like I said, thanks for watching, and until next time, thank you.